British government decided that it would not offer Aisha Bibi sanctuary in this country, citing security concerns. Anjem Chowdhury, a hate preacher whose supporters rub shoulders with the Dawah team here at Speaker's Corner, is protected by the British state. And it's your fault, every one of you who votes Conservative, who votes Labour, who votes Liberal Democrat. It's your fault. Like the movements in Poland and Eastern Europe, where a muscular Christianity is affecting the state. We need that muscular Christianity in the West to push back against the Macrons and the Merkels, the Camerons and the Theresa Mays. Yeah. So the next topic that I want to talk about is about what has recently happened in the British government with regards to the case of Aisha Bibi. I don't know if many people know what happened to Aisha Bibi. She was a Christian farm labourer working in Pakistan who was falsely accused of blasphemy by Muslim farm workers, which is a law that is used in Pakistan on many occasions to settle disputes. And it is sufficient within Pakistani society that accusation is equal to guilt. Much like we've got at the moment where if someone is accused of a sexual offence, even though it might have happened 40 years ago, the Liberal progressives are willing to call you guilty regardless of any external evidence to prove the point. The accusation is enough. Now, Aisha Bibi has spent nearly 10 years in a Pakistani prison for no greater crime than simply standing up for herself when she was defending her faith when she was being bullied by Pakistani Pakistani Muslims. And she has spent 10 years in prison. Her court case finally came to the High Court, and God bless the judges, they did the right thing, so keep them in your prayers. Because now that they have acquitted her, the lives of those Muslim judges is at stake. So please honour their justice by praying for them. Now, the fact of the matter is, Christians called out to their governments to offer Aisha Bibi sanctuary. And the British government decided that it would not offer Aisha Bibi sanctuary in this country, citing security concerns. Now just think about what that implies for a second. The British state has decided that whilst it's constantly professing how it gives amnesty to refugees and how it wants to do its part to help the persecuted Muslims freeing the Ba'athist regime in Syria in their tens of thousands, whilst ignoring, incidentally, the Christian Syrians who can't go to the UN camps because the people that persecuted them in their hometown are the same people in those camps, has basically said that it will not take Aisha Bibi into this country, citing security concerns. In other words, the British government is afraid of the Islamists. The British government is kowtowing to the Islamists, and they are doing it on your behalf. You voted them in power, they are doing it because you put them there. Every time you vote Labour, every time you vote Conservative, every time you vote Liberal Democrat, you put these kind of quibblings, these kind of snivelling, yellow-bellied, virtue-signalling, hypocritical chicken shits into power, who have then turned away a genuine Christian refugee from Pakistan, citing security concerns. So let us just do a thought experiment, as we are able to as reasonable people. What could those security concerns be? Is the British government saying that they can't protect one person, Aisha Bibi, despite the fact that they spent millions of pounds protecting, is it what's his guy? No, I was going to get to him, JC. You're stealing my thunder, mate. Who's the Rushdie bloke, the guy that wrote the Satan? Salman Rushdie. They spent millions of pounds protecting a middle class, upper crust, bourgeois writer, but because you've got a peasant woman, a peasant Christian from Pakistan, a nobody, but who the church honours as a confessor, and we honour her as a confessor of the faith because she has suffered for the name of Christ. They couldn't protect her. Anjem Chowdhury, a hate preacher whose supporters rub shoulders with the Dawah team here at Speaker's Corner, is protected by the British state, but they can't protect a peasant woman, a peasant Christian called Aisha Bibi. Is that the security concern? Because if that is truly pathetic. Or is it that they are scared of rioting in the streets of Bradford and Birmingham in the UK, like they've been rioting in Pakistan, where the Islamists so enraged that this small, insignificant to the world peasant Christian labourer should be acquitted of a false charge to which there was absolutely zero evidence, but we as the church honour her as a confessor of the faith? Or are they saying that that's the security concern? What exactly is the security concern that our establishment is so terrified of that they are not willing to offer this poor woman sanctuary? As it happens, God bless the government of New Zealand, they have taken her in. But what does that say about Pakistan? A country that has enough money to build nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them, but doesn't have the means to protect its Christian minorities. Why the hell is the British government giving aid to this shithole of a country?
Exactly.
This country in which Christians are being persecuted is receiving millions upon millions of pounds of your money. And it can afford to build nuclear bombs to destroy India. It can afford to build the jets to deliver the missiles to deliver those nuclear bombs, but it can't afford to give the basics of security and infrastructure to its own people, and particularly the Christians in that country. And yet your government has deemed fit to give them your money. You should campaign to have all aid stopped to Pakistan unless it goes directly to the churches and the Christians. No government aid should go to Pakistan until it deals with its problem of persecuting Christians. Now, it begs the question, since over 90% of the Muslims in this country come from Pakistan, do we not see the correlation between that fact and the fact that recent studies commissioned by Channel 4, not some right-wing, evil, Nazi, far-right group, but by Channel 4 and leading members of the establishment, and by groups like Pew Research, academics in university from across the world, who have shown that at least 30% of Muslims in this country are happy to see people punished for insulting Muhammad. And your government is happy to let that go unchallenged. And it's your fault, every one of you who votes Conservative, who votes Labour, who votes Liberal Democrat, it's your fault. You're the ones that put them in power without ever reading their manifesto, without ever holding them to account for the fact that they are passing policies that never appear in the manifesto, like the Conservatives did when they redefined the definition of marriage. They never had that in any manifesto, and you let them do it. until you find the balls to stand up to the people that see themselves as your rulers and betters, nothing will change. And you will not find the balls to stand up to your leaders and betters until you have a narrative to order your life that is bigger than the idea of a liberal democracy. And that narrative, my friends, is being a disciple of Christ. Because as a Christian, there is something higher in terms of authority for me than the British Parliament. It is the teaching of the prophets and the apostles. There is something more important to me than liberal civic society. It is the success and triumph of the church. There is something that I am willing to die for, which means that if I am willing to die for it, I am willing to endure every other kind of suffering along the way. And until you have a bigger yes to your life, a bigger yes that is found in Jesus Christ, you will never, ever have the ability to do what is needed to change this society, because you simply will stop when the price becomes too high. But the price is already too high. Your children are being bombed in stadiums. They are being groomed. They are being killed. The security services have fought and against constant plots week on week, month on month. And they have admitted there are now more Islamists in this country than they have the ability to police. So what are you going to do? Are you going to keep electing the same failed politicians who are working to the same failed political narratives, thinking like a fool or like a dog returning to his vomit that you're going to get something different? You need to think outside of the box. You need to think outside of the narrative that liberal civic society wishes to impose upon you. And you do that by becoming a Christian, by becoming a radical disciple of Christ, by becoming a warrior of the kingdom of God. Now, to be clear, because there will be the idiots, the anti-fascista, the liberal progressives, the soy boys of our society, who will hear what I have said and say, oh, this man is calling for violence. I am not a pacifist, for sure. If you punch me, I will punch you back. But, however, at this moment in time, there is still a way to achieve our ends that does not need violence. It means organizing yourself politically, radically politically, in every sphere of our society, including in your local communities. You do not yet need to use any kind of violence. You do not yet need to abandon the idea of the democratic system. One, I'm going to give you 4 things that you can do. 1, stop voting for all the current political parties and start voting for alternative parties that are currently on the fringe. I don't care who you vote for, just stop voting for the main ones. 2, stop sponsoring the media. Give up your TV license. Stop buying the newspapers. Stop reading the newspapers. Starve them of money and they will fall. 3, campaign for an alternative voting system. An alternative voting system that is different from the first past the post vote. The first past the post vote is designed to keep power to the establishment. Until you change the voting system, you cannot change the establishment, because you need an alternative voting system to change the establishment. So push every political party to commit to changing the voting system in such a way that the Parliament reflects the votes of the people. So that's 3. 4, campaign for an American-style freedom of speech law. Because without an American-style freedom of speech, the establishment seek to shut you down. And if they can stop you speaking about the world in a particular language, they can prevent you from understanding the world in a particular way. So you must campaign for your freedom of speech. My family,
set up local assemblies.
my family have served for generations in the military. My great-grandfather, who I remember today, who died in the fights around the Somme, I remember him. He didn't die to bequeath to me a nation owned by the soy boy international class that presumed to be my betters today. He died to bequeath to me a free society. And we, in the last 60 years, have fallen asleep and stumbled into an increasingly oppressive society run by an international class who are all buddies to one another. They all know one another. They drink with one another. They go on holiday together. They scratch one another's back and they do one another's favors, and they control you. Until you start throwing spanners in their works, like Trump. Whatever we think of Trump, he's a spanner in the internationalist setup. Like the president of Hungary, who has set up an entire department to help persecuted Christians. Let's pray for that president and pray for presidents like him, because he's a spanner in the works of the international movement. Like the movements in Poland and Eastern Europe, where a muscular Christianity is affecting the state, is affecting the culture. We need that muscular Christianity in the West to push back against the Macrons and the Merkels, the Camerons and the Theresa Mays.
Yes.
That is what we need. You're not going to find it amongst the Marxists and the communists. Those revolutionary ideologies are built upon a false utopia. And the idea of ethno-nationalism is something that I am totally opposed to. I'm against any kind of fascism or Nazism. What we need is a muscular faith, a rediscovery of our own Christian heritage in the West, and a willingness to push back against those social elites who presume to put our faith in a box where it does not belong. You can do those things. You can do those things. You must get politically motivated. You must get politically mobilized. You must get politically organized. And you must learn to defend yourself against the liberal narrative being pushed by those liars on Channel 4, those liars on the BBC, those people who mentioned the case of Aisha Bibi without ever talking about the plight of Pakistani Christians, who as soon as they could stopped talking about the Syrian Christians who were being killed by ISIS, and who never talk about the anti-Christian pogroms in Egypt, who never want to talk about the death camps in North Korea where Christians are dying. You have got to stand up for a Christian narrative. You've got to stand up for a muscular faith. We have had bloodless revolutions in this country before, and it is high time that we have a bloodless revolution again. And until we start speaking the language of bloodless revolution, we will not have one. The establishment has to go. And when we fill the parliament with people who represent the people, as opposed to people who want to tell the people what to do, one of the first things those politicians have to do is clear out the judiciary, because many of our judges are corrupt. Many of our judges are political activists rather than simply judiciaries over the law. Those are 5 things that you can do. It's high time you start doing them.
What do we do about PayPal international government?
So, let us deal with the question about social forums. The social media is currently trying to deplatform anyone who critiques the internationalist narrative. Well, the answer is simple, isn't it? We live in a capitalist society. Simply create an alternative to PayPal. One in which people who are struggling against the internationalist elites can organize themselves without being shut down by the people that control it. Set up your own YouTubes, set up your own Twitters, set up your own Patreons, set up your own. I mean, there's plenty of talent in the church. We have all the expertise necessary to do everything that I'm talking about. The church does not lack for the resource, the skill, or the ability. It only lacks the leadership, the direction, the vision, the imagination, and the courage to do it. We do not need the state for anything. We can organize our own structures within the church across the entire country and across the entire world. And we can provide those frameworks by which those that are opposing the liberal progressive internationalist ideologies of liberalism and liberal humanism can be funded and focused, can be supported. We must rail against this anti-Christian movement that has taken over the UN, that has taken over the EU, that has taken over the infrastructure of the British state. And we can do it using our own infrastructure known as the church. We have all the resources we need. We just need the vision, the leadership, the courage and the conviction to do it. Any other questions?
Do you think that capitalism can reform itself, or do you think that it should be knocked down and we should start from scratch?
Okay. Do I think that capitalism can reform itself? Fundamentally, where I stand on all the questions of economics is that I want justice for the poorest. The Christian narrative is one in which the poor should always be remembered, and that a measure of a society is how it helps those who are poorest within it, on the fringes of its economy. And there is no economic system in the world or in history that has lifted more people out of poverty than capitalism. However, capitalism constantly needs to be corrected because it fundamentally works on the basis of allowing human greed to flourish. So there must be a constant, deliberate attempt to correct the excesses of capitalism by taking from the top and giving it to the bottom. And that has to be done through a tax system that is fair. So, does capitalism have the power to correct itself? Yes, it does. That is the nature of capitalism. Does it need a conscience? Absolutely. The failure of the neoliberals and Margaret Thatcher's kind of capitalism is it switched off the conscience of capitalism. Capitalism works, it lifts people out of poverty and has lifted more people out of poverty than communism and socialism ever have. But it never must be allowed to run rampant. We must have a conscious collective use of capitalism to generate money in a way that is used not to forget the poorest. Within the Christian community, we have a concept that we see in the book of Acts of what we can rightly term as elective socialism, which means that if you choose to, you can enter into those bonds of fellowship in which you share all things in common like you would in a communist society. And at that small level, not at the great meta-narrative paradigm of society, but at that small level, you can create collectives in which resources are shared. And I personally believe that what we need is a synthesis between capitalism that will generate wealth and then elective, optional, where you choose, not where it's forced upon you, but where you choose to share your resources in collectives with the people who have been forgotten by the meta-narrative, the paradigm of capitalism. Let someone else ask a question, then I'll come back to you. Any other questions? Any other questions? Any other questions or all?
I'll take a question.
Okay.
Okay, so you say about how you have to redistribute the wealth from the top to the bottom.
Yes.
How would you do that in a morally coherent way?
Okay, so I would say to all these virtue signalling hypocrites like Richard Branson and all of you clowns at the top who make a show and a parade of how you give to charity, if you are truly socialist as you claim to be, because we know you're not, we know that it's just a fashion for you, that you're just champagne socialists, here's what you should do: set up communist communes in which you will share your wealth and your resources with the poorest people, the roughest people on the council estates. And I'll tell you why you won't do it. Because you wouldn't want to dirty your fingers shaking the hands of some rough lad on a council estate or some struggling mother on a council estate.
We know Richard Branson sued the NHS, right?
Yeah. You sued the NHS. You're hypocrites, you people. You want to preach socialism, but you practice capitalism. We all see you with your fashion labels. Yeah? If you're truly about helping the poorest, take your millions and go and live amongst them. We Christians do. I know personally that Christians from wealthy communities, successful Christians who make hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, sometimes millions, optionally choose to go and live in council estates, in the poorest communities. It is an aspect of Christian spirituality that our priests and our nuns will go out of their way to find the most excluded. An organisation, for example, called Opus Dei, that I worked with in Colombia when I was living there, they would collect youth from the richest areas in Colombia, and they would go to the Barrios Popular. The Barrios Popular, for those not familiar with the language, are the Colombian equivalent of the favelas. They are the poorest of the poorest. And they would go there and they would go and interact with the poorest people, because it is an intrinsic part of Christian spirituality that you seek out the poorest and the most hurting and you minister to them the love of Christ. We do not need to take lectures from communists and socialists and champagne hypocrites. You need to learn from us what it means to stand in solidarity with the poor, because we have been doing it for 2,000 years. You are the newcomers on the block and you have no idea what you're doing.
Good question. How do you reconcile that, what you just said, with the fact that the Vatican, the Catholic Church, has assets of over £8 billion, yet there are many people starving today in Africa, America, and they're living on $1 a day?
Yeah, that's fine. I will address that question very easily. This is the kind of nonsensical argument that is made by liberal progressives who have no understanding of the Christian faith or history. Let us just get it into its proper context. In Britain alone, the Salvation Army numbers less than 250,000 people. And it, on its own, this Christian mission, does more charitable work with ex-prisoners, with single parents, with those needing food banks, with the homeless, with the destitute, than any other organisation in the country. The only organisation that does more than the Salvation Army is the state. And that is before we add on to that fact all the other churches and all the other Christian organisations that go out and work with the same groups of people. I am proud of the record of the church in its work helping the poor. The Catholic Church on its own, did you hear that? The Catholic Church on its own does more charity work than any other organisation anywhere in the world, including the UN. The UN, it's arguable, may do more, but that basically means that every country in the world has to organise itself to do more than the Catholic Church does, that the Catholic Church does more than anyone else. So I am not ashamed of what the Catholic Church does to help the poor. Bearing in mind, it was the Christians that launched the Jubilee campaign to end third world debt. It wasn't liberal, progressive, socialists and communists. It was the Christians. We did it. So then directly to answering the question about the Vatican. The Vatican is the heritage of Europe. The Vatican and the Catholic Church is the singular institution of European civilization, particularly in the West. In the East, it's the Orthodox churches, and as an institution, it has travelled through 2,000 years of history, collecting donations and gifts over those 2,000 years. Christians, we want to give our best to God, so we build temples for the church that glorify God, so that we can worship God in places that are of such a prestigious nature to match the high glory that we give to God. The 8 billion assets in the Vatican would not be a drop in the ocean in terms of helping the poor. It would be the equivalent of giving a man a sandwich today so he could starve again tomorrow. The Pope has spoken out, and popes have spoken out year on year on year on year down through the centuries, consistently reminding man of his obligation to the poorest. I do not feel any shame in the church in how it has assets. Those are our assets. We've collected them over 2,000 years, and we do more than anyone else to help the poor. Next question.
History has shown us that the powers that own all the wealth are going to fight tooth and nail rather than sharing those resources. Other than the potential threat of violence, what are the actual processes in which we can use legal means by which to extrapolate that wealth and share it amongst the poor? So at the moment, for example, a handful of people own more wealth than half the world's population.
Yeah.
It's just gone beyond, and the people will not take it anymore. And if it continues like this, they will resort to violence. We want to avoid that. What processes would you say, legal processes, in which that wealth could be extrapolated?
Okay, so let's just deal with this. We've tried violent communist revolutions before in history. We had them in Russia. They took over the Eastern Bloc. We had them in Cuba. We had them in Venezuela. Look at all those countries now. Communism didn't just fail in those countries, it destroyed them and held them back. Those countries now are playing catch up to the capitalistic West because of the violent communist revolutions. So anyone who's teaching an identity of the proletariat, I want to say as a Christian, I oppose you. Anyone who's talking about class solidarity, I want to say as a Christian, I oppose you. Those that set man against man for the envy of money are simply expressing sin, the sin of envy and greed. And let's be honest, that is all that communism is. If capitalism is the expression of greed, communism is the expression of envy. And both of these things are cardinal sins. As Christians, I oppose them both. And as a Christian, I oppose ideologies built upon them. In terms of the question, the legal framework by which we can redress the imbalance is to create those predicates within our society in which the gospel advances and more people convert, including the richest. And when they are rich, they, by the nature of their faith, will be inspired to give more to the poor, to release more of their wealth. And then the state can also facilitate that by legally constituting societies within society in which those who want to be communist and champagne socialist can prove the virtue of their rhetoric by taking their millions and living with the poor as we do. So the state can facilitate redistribution. It can do it in its taxes, so long as those taxes are not such a weight that they oppress capitalism's ability to produce wealth. They can do it by facilitating a culture that creates the formation of the inner man in which people want to voluntarily distribute their wealth, and it can create the structures by which, when they choose to do so, it is organized in a proper fashion, targeted to help the people that need it the most. We need a bloodless revolution in our society. What we must not listen to are those champagne socialists, those virtue signalling hypocrites, people like Jeremy Corbyn and his Marxist ideology, who want to push some crap about class solidarity. Let's be clear, the Labour Party failed the working class. It was Labour MPs and Labour councillors who were oppressing and seeking to brush under the carpet the fact that working class girls were being groomed by Muslim gangs. We don't need Labour in this country. We don't need the trade unionists. Those trade unionists are simply using the narrative of the working class to make themselves rich, to push their own ideology. They too betrayed those working class girls who were abused by Muslim grooming gangs. We don't need these communists. What we need is a rediscovery of a muscular Christian faith, a heritage older than the UK, a heritage older than the EU, a heritage older than Karl Marx, a heritage older than socialism. We need to rediscover that faith and to stand on it and to push back against all these phony revolutionaries and all these virtue signalling hypocrites and all these internationalist elites and these Islamists, gangs and thugs that are seeking to take over communities. That's what we need, and we need it sooner rather than later. Any other questions?